It's been stated both here and abroad that George W. Bush has brought about the most faith-based administration in American history. This program will attempt to determine whether or not that statement is true, to explore what other presidents have had to say about faith, and how or if it is woven into the fabric of the nation.
Historians may quibble, but the fact is George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and George W. Bush are the only presidents who have had to contend with the ravages of war on our own soil. The reliance placed on God by both Washington and Lincoln is well documented. But what will history have to say about George W. Bush? Is he a man of faith? Very early on, while still campaigning for the nomination, he implied that he was when the moderator in the Iowa debate asked each candidate to name the philosopher they admired most.
Governor Bush, a philosopher thinker, and why?
Christ, because he changed my heart.
The question was simple and straightforward. The answer came without hesitation. But in the nation's capital, a shockwave rumbled through the halls of government.
Why? Was this answer so far removed from the positions taken by other candidates, even other presidents? Critics and pundits were quick to suggest that he was just a politician cynically pandering to the voters of the religious right. Bush's answer was clear and to the point. My faith is an integral part of my whole being. That's what faith is. I don't think you can separate your faith from who you are. But was George W. Bush the first major political figure to come on the scene who was willing to admit he was guided by a resolute moral compass, fixed firmly in the principles of Christianity? Even a cursory review of history would seem to suggest exactly the opposite.
Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principles.
The longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men.
And whereas it is the duty of nations as well as of men to own their dependence upon the overruling power of God, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in the Holy Scriptures and proven by all history, that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord.
Reaction to Bush's comment in the Iowa debate in 1999 was perhaps predictable. Confusion, even among some of his close friends and advisors.
When he made the Christ statement, I knew he was speaking from the heart, but as a friend, I thought he had committed political suicide.
When I heard Bush speak so frankly from his heart about Christ, I knew he had just won the election.
Bush won by the narrowest margin in political history. Now the question was, had the nation elected a man of faith and strong Christian principles, or simply a clever political opportunist?
The controversy engendered by Bush's remark would continue throughout the campaign and, in fact, throughout his presidency. But one thing became abundantly clear.
In spite of the fact that every president of the United States has expressed deference to and at least some reverence for God, in the case of Bush, his critics even today seem almost angry in their denunciations.
By contrast, the faith of George Washington has been not only acknowledged, but revered. When George was leaving home to begin a life of service to God and country, his mother said to him,
"Remember that God only is our sure trust. To him I commend you, my son. Neglect not the duty of secret prayer."
Was Bush suggesting something that set him apart from other men who have occupied the White House?
Bush has a moral clarity befitting a world leader as opposed to the relativist view of many European leaders and much of the left in this country.
Many Americans today seem to be re-evaluating their spiritual lives, trying to get at what is most important. Could it be that religious moral clarity is precisely what the public is looking for in a leader? In spite of pundits and politicians, it seems that mainstream America does in fact want leadership with strong moral and ethical character.
Following the attack of September 11th, the nation's churches were filled. People all across the country rallied behind President Bush, just as they had rallied around George Washington.
Still, there was an undercurrent of fear and doubt in America that could be felt from the most humble pew to the highest levels of government. At such a time, the nation needed strong moral leadership and genuine statesmanship. But do most Americans necessarily connect a man of faith with a person they can trust? Indeed, the president's critics are quick to claim that precisely the opposite is true. For example, screen actor Richard Gere was quoted as saying,
"One thing I've learned in my life is never to trust anyone who thinks that he exclusively has God on his side, especially when he's the President of the United States."
From the outside, you've got attacks on America and on the rest of the Western world from radical Islamic fundamentalism. At the same time, there's a struggle going on inside America, and it's a struggle between those who regard Judeo-Christian values as vital for our nation's survival and those who view those values as horrible obstructions to progress. The future of our nation depends upon the outcome of this struggle.
given that fact, what is there to suggest that a man of faith is more trustworthy? Are there historic examples of great leaders who, when faced with critical choices, found strength in prayer and supplication?
Going back to the very beginning, George Washington, the great hero of the Revolution, our first president, and often referred to as the father of our country, said,
"It is impossible to rightly govern in the world without God and the Bible."
If that's true, then the question became, was George Bush a man of sufficient spiritual strength and dedication to lead the nation through the difficult times we were facing, both inside the nation and from without? Those who know him best, such as religious broadcaster and friend James Robeson, were unyielding in their support.
I'm convinced that President Bush has very deep convictions related to his beliefs based upon principles that could be traced back to the Judeo-Christian ethic. I do not believe for one moment, however, that he would seek to manipulate others nor impose his beliefs. I think that he, in the truest sense of the word, seeks to let the light shine, and its radiant effect has a positive effect on others.
Every person I've taken to meet the president is immediately won over by the sincerity of his faith, but they're also struck by the fact that he doesn't make grandiose claims about it. President Bush's form of Christianity is somewhere in between mainstream Christianity and evangelicalism. It's very compatible with Catholicism as well, but he's really a kind of perfect mediator between the mainstream Catholics and evangelicals.
He is by all accounts a deeply religious man and one who believes in the power of prayer. In fact, I've heard several accounts of the president being found in the Oval Office on his knees in prayer.
My oldest son Rob was a part of the George Bush campaign for president and later became chief of staff of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and an advisor to Vice President Cheney. On February 8, 2003, we received this hurried call. My son Jamal said that, "Dad, we're overturned in the car." And the rescue workers came and told us that our son was dead. And the next day we were just a mess. And then about 10:30 in the morning, I was lying on the bed and my wife comes into the room with the phone and says, "Bob, President Bush is on the phone. He's calling from Air Force One." And it just sort of amazed me. And so I took the phone and the president said, "Bob, how sorry I am that Rob died, my precious friend." And he consoled me for about 7 minutes. And he said, "I'm getting ready to call Michelle and pray with her." And he called my daughter-in-law, Michelle, and she told me that he read scripture and prayed with her. And she said, "Well, Mr. President, I'm just happy that you're calling, but I know you have heavy burdens." He said, "Michelle, you are the one that we need to be talking about and concentrating on, not me." But if you need me, you know where Laura, know where we are. I was just so moved and uplifted that a man of such importance, with all of the burdens of the world on his shoulders, that he could take the time to console us at this moment. And in the next week, I had 2 other occasions to be with the president, had a small breakfast at the White House. And I was again amazed because as we greeted one another, he kissed me on the cheek and was nearly in tears, and I found myself comforting him because he said, "Oh, I miss Rob so much. He was so much a part of this campaign, so much a part of my life." And I'll never forget this man, as long as I live, for what he did to comfort us.
But from all accounts, he was just another hard-drinking young man caught up in the boom and bust of the oil business in Midland, Texas. How did the president come to be such a man of faith? And was encouraging faith among the people in harmony with other great American leaders?
Were my soul trembling on the wing of eternity? Were this hand freezing to death? Were my voice choking with last struggle? I would still, with the last gasp of that voice, implore you to remember the truth. God has given America to be free.
Few doubted that the nation was about to go through one of the most difficult and challenging times in our history. But was turning to God the answer? Thomas Jefferson seemed to think so.
God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God? They are not to be violated, but with His wrath. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that His justice cannot sleep forever.
George W. Bush is the firstborn son of a man who believed strongly in the spiritual roots of his family and the nation. But his father was also a man who was willing to set aside the trappings of wealth to which he was born. Intent on making it on his own in what was called the oil patch, George Herbert Walker Bush moved his young family to Midland, Texas.
As a boy, George W. Bush attended San Jacinto Junior High, ran for president of his 7th grade class, and won. He got straight A's, starred in football and baseball, and was known as a popular kid with a big mouth. He was arrogant, aggressive, fast, and sarcastic.
It was not the ideal resume for a future president of the United States. His world was a combination of Texas bravado and the transplanted Ivy League of his father.
If it's true a man is a product of his environment, the environment in which George W. Bush grew up in Midland, Texas in the 50s was very similar to the one in which I grew up. You had your old hard-knock ranchers and your old hard-drinking, hard-driving oil field people, and then you had some executives moving in. People accepted you for your word, for your integrity, and for how capable you were at your job. Politics was certainly something people talked about, but most of the men in Midland, frankly, weren't interested in things outside Texas too much.
But religion was an important part of George Bush's upbringing, as evidenced by the Bush family involvement in Midland's First Presbyterian Church. It was a life full of opportunities for a boy to grow into manhood with the solid example of parents, friends, and community to follow.
Knowing George as I know him and knowing how he and his wife and daughters were when they were in Midland is somewhat of a snapshot of the way he grew up in the 50s, which was loyalty to his marriage, to his family. Things he was interested in were doing well in school, doing well in athletics, being true to your word, faith, family, and friends.
Only one thing seems to have marred his childhood. Stephen Mansfield, author of The Faith of George W. Bush, recalls that event.
His little sister Robin lost a 7-month battle with leukemia. The psychological stress and depression in the family was so severe that they actually felt physical pain.
Bush has described the death of his sister as the starkest memory of his childhood, a sharp pain in the midst of an otherwise happy blur. What's more, George felt the anguish of his parents very deeply, especially that of his grieving mother. David Aikman, author of A Man of Faith, The Spiritual Journey of George Bush, picks up the story.
When his father was away from home, George W. assumed a protective presence over his mother, and even though he was only a boy, he felt the most important thing in life was to comfort her. It got to where he would do just about anything to cheer her. He'd tell stories, jokes, anything to see a smile on his mother's face again. One day, Barbara heard George W. telling a boyhood friend that he couldn't come out and play with him because his mother needed him. In her memoirs, Barbara Bush would write that that was the moment that her cure began. She realized that her grief was too much of a burden for her 7-year-old son to carry.
This story reveals something about George W. Bush that's very, very important. He felt that he could lift the depression in the family home and change the mood by his presence, by his stories. I believe that as a leader, he feels the same thing, and this is what we see following September the 11th.
But there were other influences in Midland as well, and a young George Bush, with the mud of the oil patch on his boots and a thirst that comes with a throat full of Texas dust, was not immune from them. Critics suggested that you can take the boy out of Midland, but you can't take Midland out of the boy. According to Bob Woodson, civil rights activist and founder of neighborhood-based organizations to prevent gang violence, the president addressed that notion with typical Bush candor.
After he became president, I joined a group of religious leaders meeting in the White House with the president. He said, "You know, I had a drinking problem one time. I really should be in a bar in Texas, not in the Oval Office. But only through the grace of God and His mercy and through the power of prayer was I delivered from my problems. And I ask you to pray for me."
On the verge of his 40th birthday, he made a decision that turned his life around.
When George W. Bush turned 40 in July of 1986, he and Laura, with some friends, went to Colorado Springs to celebrate his birthday. That evening, he had too much wine to drink at dinner, and when he woke up the next morning, he had a hangover. He went out for a 3-mile run, which is his practice, and during that 3-mile run, he decided he was never going to take another drink. And he came back and he told Laura that morning that he was never going to take another drink.
Of course, many of us have heard that kind of commitment, especially from heavy drinkers who want to stop, but soon slip back into another drinking binge. Would this be just one of those commitments, soon to be discarded?
George just isn't like that. When he made that commitment to Laura, he was suddenly stone cold sober. And he had the character and the willingness and the capacity to remain that way the rest of his life. I'm sure it was his Christian faith that gave him the strength to do so. I mean, if his faith was somewhat lax before that, it certainly wasn't afterwards. He became a changed man in a lot of ways. He stopped chewing and cussing and became an extraordinarily disciplined guy.
He told me that that he had had an encounter with God that had not only changed his life where he was no longer drinking at all, totally quit, but that had redirected his future. And I believe, frankly, the greatest change in President Bush is not what he stopped doing, but what he began to do. He began to live for others.
It's unbelievable how he structures his White House day to include, in addition to his long work day, a physical workout, prayer time, Bible reading, time to talk with his girls, his wife, his parents, in addition to reading a 12-inch stack of briefing papers and a book every single day. What's even more amazing is his respect for the Oval Office itself. He treats it like a sacred trust, a sacred place, and won't even enter the Oval Office without wearing a suit, even during non-working hours on the weekend. And he also expects everyone else to wear proper business attire. There are no casual dress Fridays, and what's more, he expects everyone to respect each other, to be on time for meetings, to get their work in on time, and he encourages everyone to pray and read the Bible every day.
But this regimen and his reliance on prayer drives some critics up the wall. Robert Scheer of the LA Times wrote,
"Of course, as a self-described messenger of God, who was praying for strength to do the Lord's will, Bush was not troubled about shredding a little secular document called the U.S. Constitution.
In spite of over 225 years of history to the contrary, the notion that our leaders should have God in their lives has suddenly become threatening to the public good. Why? What was different with the Bush presidency? Andrew Johnson, who became president upon the death of Abraham Lincoln, said,
"Let us look forward to the time when we can take the flag of our country and nail it below the cross, and there let it wave as it waved in olden times, and let us gather around it and inscribe for our motto, Liberty and Union, one and inseparable, now and forever, and exclaim, Christ first, our country next."
One can't help but wonder what today's critics would have had to say about President Johnson. But for the moment, let's give critics the benefit of the doubt. How can we be sure that faith is a positive thing for America?
Faith is the framework for living. It gives us a spirit and heart that affect everything we do. It gives us hope each day. Faith gives us purpose to right wrongs, to preserve our families, and to teach our children values. Faith gives us conscience to keep us honest, even when nobody else is looking.
President Bush, it seems, was right in line with other occupants of the Oval Office. So what was different? Why the anger over this president's expression of faith? George W. Bush, perhaps more than any president of the modern era, opened his heart to the nation. He made no bones about his problems with alcohol in his younger days, and he was just as candid about his Christian faith. We asked Tom Freiling, author of George W. Bush on God and Country, if that candor had any effect on America.
I think it has clearly given Christians the strength to be more bold in their witness, in their own Christian walk. It has also given strength to Christians who are in the middle of fighting the culture war. Whether it be the issues of abortion or same-sex marriage, I think because President Bush has been so outspoken about his faith, it has allowed, or not even allowed, encouraged other Christians and especially Christian leaders to be the same way. I don't think they feel like they have to hide their Christian faith because the president doesn't hide it.
Still, there were critics who claimed his conversion had more to do with politics than religion. Al Franken, a comedian turned political pundit, said,
"Obviously, part of the premise is that this is not the most honest administration. So, I don't know what to think of his religiosity. I really can't tell you, but I'm suspicious. I'm very suspicious of the way he uses it. I'm suspicious that it's done for political purposes and that he really isn't as religious as he makes out to be."
That, of course, is Mr. Franken's opinion. What is factual is that George Bush's presidency seemed to reawaken the public interest in the faith of those who were responsible for the nation's business and safety. Still, given the fact that the change in Bush's life happened about the time he was working on his father's presidential campaign, the questions asked were,
what was it that brought about such a profound change in a young man who, to that point, had expressed no interest in politics? Was there a sudden flashpoint, or was it simply the final step in a long process?
By the mid-1980s, George Bush Sr. had become a huge public figure, and GW was anxious to help him, eager to help him, but he was nevertheless living in this long shadow of his father. This had to be difficult because George W. is a very talented guy in his own right, but trying to outdo the legacy of a father like George Bush Sr., that was a daunting task.
Like so many people, George W. Bush's life before Christ came into it was spent just trying to find his way. He'd had some success in his professional life and started his own oil exploration company. And in his personal life, he'd met and married a woman he loved, Laura, who is a strong Methodist. The problem was that he was really a man without direction, and as he neared middle age, he realized that he was going nowhere, and he desperately needed God.
The oil boom in Midland was in the process of going bust. People were going bankrupt, losing their marriages and their jobs. It was a pretty gloomy environment. But all of that was about to change.
Jesus once said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." For years, George W. Bush had been calling himself a Christian, but living a life that was far from God. But in the summer of 1985, all of that changed. During this period, the Bush family made a habit of inviting the evangelist Billy Graham, a friend of the family, to spend a few days each summer at the Bush's vacation home in Kennebunkport.
Billy Graham would sit down in the living room and answer religious questions from whoever wanted to ask them.
After a particularly moving question and answer session with Reverend Graham the night before, Bush and the evangelist took a walk on the beach together. During their conversation, Graham asked the future president, "Are you right with God?" Bush replied, "No, but I want to be."
All of his close friends agree that the Graham encounter was absolutely the event in George W.'s Christian life. He himself said that after his talk with Graham, he felt himself drawn to seek something different in his spiritual walk, something real, and that's when his life really began to change.
But even in this, the young Bush was simply emulating the great leaders who had gone before. Woodrow Wilson, president during the First World War, made it very clear.
The Bible is the one supreme source of revelation of the meaning of life, the nature of God and spiritual nature and needs of men. It is the only guide of life which really leads the spirit in the way of peace and salvation. America was a Christian nation. America was born to exemplify that devotion, the elements of righteousness which are derived from the revelations of Holy Scripture.
George W. Bush, it seems, was getting closer to the ideal established by so many presidents before him, and it was likely that he was familiar with Ronald Reagan's position. The Founding Fathers, Reagan was fond of saying, believed that faith in God was key to our being a good people and America's becoming a great nation. Could it be that the senior Bush saw that George W.'s personal life was undergoing radical changes and wanted to prepare him for changes in his professional life as well? In 1986, Bush Sr. enlisted his son's help in running his presidential campaign. As he spent time in Washington, George W. got an up-close view of the seamier side of politics. The conviction of his newfound faith was soon put to the test.
George Bush did more than just talk the talk. I remember staffers trying to get him to have intimate relations with a young lady on our staff. Of course, probably what was going on was political blackmail leverage on the son of the future President of the United States. He'd look at me and raise his eyebrows like, "Do you believe that?" On one occasion, I remember a public figure whose name you'd immediately know came in and said, "She just wants you to relax, George. She's just trying to help you relax. You've hurt her feelings." He said, "Good." He yelled it so loud you could hear it through all the offices. He said, "Not interested. I'm a married man. I'm glad she got the message. Good." As far as I know, that was the last time she ever bothered him.
But there is more than one kind of temptation in politics. Would the integrity of Bush's newfound faith stand up to all of them?
I had a congressman who wanted to see him. He had a good cause, a good project, and he wanted George W.'s help. So I had him rehearse what he was going to say in advance so I could be sure it was okay. And he got to this point in his rehearsal where he said, "And George, there's going to be something in this for you too." I said, "Don't do that. You'll turn him off. It will end. Your whole idea is going to die right at that point." And the congressman argued with me. He said, "You know, that's not how things are done here in Washington. This is quid pro quo here." And I said, "Look, you know Washington, you know politics, I know GW, and I'm telling you, you don't say that to him." And so sure enough, we meet with GW and he goes through this whole thing and GW is listening, and then he gets to that part, "There's something in this for you." And GW bolts out of his chair, he goes over, he kind of lifts this congressman to his feet and he walks him to the door and says, great conversation, I'm busy now, see you later." It was a great idea, but George W. didn't want any part of it. I mean, anything even remotely shady. It's this sense of ethics that I believe is faith-based.
Many, perhaps even most of our presidents have commented on the importance of a faith-based morality in politics. Herbert Hoover wrote,
"Menaced by collectivist trends, we must seek revival of our strength in the spiritual foundations, which are the bedrock of our republic. Democracy is the outgrowth of the religious conviction of the sacredness of every human life. On the religious side, its highest embodiment is the Bible. On the political side, the Constitution.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, who followed Hoover into the White House, agreed.
We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. Where we have been the truest and the most consistent in obeying its precepts, we have attained the greatest measure of contentment and prosperity.
Just 2 years after his father became president, George W. Bush would make the leap into politics by running for the governor of Texas, an office that even some Bush family members believed he couldn't win. It was a political victory that many have called simply impossible. Bush became the second Republican to be elected governor of Texas since the end of the Civil War.
I think it's safe to say that had George W. Bush not rededicated his life to Christ, he would not have been elected governor of Texas. He defeated Ann Richards, who was a popular, tough Democratic governor. She had run a nasty, negative campaign in her previous election, and she tried to bait George W. into responding in kind in the campaign in which he defeated her, but he refused to engage. She called him Shrub, as in Little Bush, to insinuate that he was riding his father's coattails. She even called him a jerk during the campaign, but she couldn't get George W. to take the bait. He ran a positive campaign and won with 54% of the vote. And I think part of the reason he won is that people saw evidence of the truth in him. They saw his goodness, his kindness, his truthfulness, his self-control. All these things are evidence of his walk with God.
I think he had had such a profound spiritual experience in his life that it changed his, not only his attitude, but his actions. I believe that he became a man under control, not out of control. I think that he became a man obviously guided not only with conviction, but convictions that came from principles. And he seemed to be able to express the fact that he did love his neighbor. That was more than a campaign phrase. He was loving his neighbor even when sometimes they weren't speaking well of him. And I think that was an indication of a real change in his life.
Could it be that this attitude of service is what propelled him into the White House? Or was it simply unbridled ambition, a need to follow in his father's footsteps? Would he carry that same conviction and dedication as President of the United States? One of the new president's first proposals was to call for something he called faith-based initiatives. He defined himself as a compassionate conservative and said this program was designed to help religious groups and organizations better serve the poor and indigent in their communities. Opponents insisted it was a transparent attempt to buy votes with taxpayer money. There is no precedent in American history for the Bush administration's determination to infuse government with a highly specific set of religious values, wrote Susan Jacoby of the Los Angeles Times.
I find that a curious view of history, as George Washington in 1789, in his inaugural address, said that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. Our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge, wrote, "The foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country."
The big question is, have we reached that point in our history where faith in the Bible is no longer practically universal? If that is the case, it has come about in very recent times. Ronald Reagan certainly didn't shy away from the Bible or a sense of its almost universal acceptance. Let us, young and old, join together, as did the First Continental Congress, in the first step, humble, heartfelt prayer. Let's do so for the love of God and His great goodness, in search of His guidance and the grace of repentance, in seeking His blessings, His peace, and the resting of His kind and holy hands on ourselves, our nation, our friends in the defense of freedom, and all mankind, now and always.
In 1963, the Supreme Court, without citing a single precedent, handed down a ruling that turned nearly 200 years of constitutional law on its head. Prayer in public schools, the court said, was unconstitutional. Separation of church and state became a mantra that over the years has pitted the courts against virtually every public institution, including itself. By the time George W. Bush reached the presidency, the courts and other officials were going so far as to attack prayer in elementary school. In Texas, a district judge told high school students that any student uttering the word Jesus at the school's graduation would be arrested and locked up. In Missouri, a fourth grader who bowed his head in silent prayer before his lunch is ridiculed for his religious beliefs and given a week's detention. In a New York kindergarten, Kayla Broadus held hands with two students seated next to her while reciting a small prayer over her food. She was silenced and scolded by the teacher and taken before the school's lawyer, who concluded her behavior violated the separation of church and state. This settled court policy, some 40 years in the making, was the barrier faced by Bush and his faith-based initiatives. Indeed, that attitude permeated virtually anything the president said or did that touched on faith in any way. But some powerful voices were beginning to speak out against the radical shift in public policy regarding the careful balance in the relationship between church and state.
Everyone today seems to think the Constitution expressly provides for separation of church and state. Ask any 10 people if it's not so, and I'll bet you most of them will say, well, sure. And some will point out, it's in the First Amendment. Wrong. Read it. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Where is the word separate? Where are the words church or state?
Even the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, wrote, the U.S. was not founded on church-state separation. In its 1963 ruling, the High Court, he said, ignored history, legal precedent, and the constitutional framers' clear intent. But when President George W. Bush suggested faith-based initiatives on a national level, opposition was thunderous. Robin Levin, a Southern Methodist University ethics professor, said,
clearly what I'm hearing is a sense of religious calling, and not even around the mission or goal of the country, but a sense of religious calling for the policies of this president.
Could we be approaching the calamity President Truman warned us against?
The fundamental basis of our nation's laws was given to Moses on the Mount. The fundamental basis of our Bill of Rights comes from the teachings we get from Exodus and St. Matthew, from Isaiah and St. Paul. I don't think we emphasize that enough these days. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we will finally end up with totalitarian government, which does not believe in rights for anybody except the state.
George W. Bush continued to be in very good company, and he continued to be George W. Bush. Regardless of the political outcome, things that were once commonplace but jettisoned somewhere along the way returned. The president encouraged Bible study, opened meetings with prayer, and unabashedly referenced God in his public pronouncements. According to Newsweek magazine, quote, this presidency is the most resolutely faith-based in modern times, an enterprise founded, supported, and guided by trust in the temporal and spiritual power of God. And BBC correspondent Justin Webb reported that nobody in government spends more time on his knees than George W. Bush. The Bush administration hums to the sound of prayer. And George Bush clearly wanted his example to go well beyond the White House.
It was quite an honor to be invited to the ranch. I told my wife prior to getting there, I hope we just get in this white pickup truck and take off. And I hadn't been there a minute before he showed me around the house and said, as soon as I get through letting you see the home here and our house, he said, I want us to get in that pickup truck and we're going to get out of here. I thought, well, that's great. And sure enough, we did. We began to ride with the dogs in our lap and spilling his coffee, and he's trying to balance it as we rode along. He's telling me about the trees, about how much he enjoys the running creek water and the low water crossings and the wildlife. And he said, I want to show you something. He said, we talked about the importance of praying and getting alone where you can really meditate. And he said, let me show you where I go. And basically he was going to show me a couple of places, and he pointed to a high hill. He said, I get up there alone and I really pray, and I seek God's will and ask for God's blessings and direction. and the dogs are moving about, and we just had a great time of fellowship, but we talked about God. We talked about concerns for our country and issues of life, and you know, he is a man that really does want wisdom and wants people to pray for him, and he believes that we need insight, not only from wise counsel but beyond ourselves. He believes that God can direct us in our thoughts and in our actions.
George W. does not believe that he sees handwriting on the wall or hears an audible voice from God. What he does believe is that he senses the promptings of God in his heart, and he speaks in those terms in his private moments. Many of those around him urge him to be even more attuned to those promptings from God.
Sam Hainem is an all-American kid with dreams for a bright future. But a deadly disease, cystic fibrosis, threatens to cut his life short and makes every day a struggle to survive.
The Starlight Foundation is an organization that grants wishes to children with serious and terminal illnesses. And when they approached Sam to grant him a wish, the thing he wanted most was to meet the President of the United States.
I wrote them a letter telling them how much I appreciated the President being a Christian and a man of faith. And I wrote them a letter requesting that I meet him. And they got my letter and accepted my request.
Sam's visit was scheduled for March 12th, just 3 days after his 13th birthday. And although the family didn't know it at the time, their visit to Washington would come just 1 week before the start of the Iraqi war.
With all that was going on, the most powerful man in the world took time out of his schedule to meet with my son. It blew me away. It just really touched my father's heart. At any time in this whole process, he could have canceled because we were right in the verge of going to war with Iraq. But he didn't. He kept his word and he kept the meeting with my son, and it really touched our family, and I know it touched my son.
Sam and his family arrived at the White House and were escorted into the diplomatic room by the Secret Service. The big moment had arrived.
The President and Laura Bush came into the room, and they were so friendly and kind. They took pictures with us, and the President asked me about my life at home, and even about my dog Mariah. It was extra special for me because the President has presidential time and personal time, and he took this out of his personal time to make it extra special. He did this for me just to bless me.
The President then gave young Sam a gift, an autographed baseball decorated with the presidential seal. But Sam had something very special for the President as well.
One of the things about children like Sam who suffer from cystic fibrosis is they have choices to make as to how they're going to handle their disease. And Sam's choice has been to draw closer to God, because there are some times when he's so sick he just doesn't know how he's going to make it. And rather than getting angry and bitter at God, he's just learned to draw closer. And Sam wanted to share that with the President.
I gave him a Bible that had President George W. Bush engraved on the outside. And on the inside, on a bookmark, were the initials F-R-O-G on it.
The President opened the Bible and, seeing the unusual bookmark, asked Sam to explain.
I told him that I'm a Christian, and whenever I see a frog bookmark, the letters remind me that the only way to live is to fully rely on God. And he said, "Well then, Sam, I guess that means I'm a frog too."
As their time together came to a close, Sam and his parents walked with the President and his wife to the White House helipad where Marine One was waiting.
And I said to him, I just want to thank you for doing this for my son, and also to let you know that we're praying for you as a family. And as he looked back, there was almost like tears in his eyes, and he said, thank you, that means a lot to me.
The President and his wife boarded the helicopter. Their ultimate destination? The Azores, where British Prime Minister Tony Blair and the President of Spain were waiting to discuss the final details of Operation Iraqi Freedom. It's a sort of unwritten rule that the President will at no time take gifts to his aircraft. But on this particular day, he made an exception.
Laura Bush's assistant told my father that he personally asked for the Bible to be transported to Air Force One.
With the weight of the world on his shoulders, President Bush found a way to share time with the 13-year-old whose greatest wish was to give the President a Bible. But there were those in Washington who expressed a much different view of the President. Barry Lynn, Executive Director of Americans United, told a congressional panel,
"We continue to careen dangerously down the path of government-supported religion. Congress has a duty to apply the brakes. Madison would have been horrified at the notion that Congress or the President would embark on the reckless journey of taxpayer funding of religion."
But is that true? Did the founders, in fact, intend to keep religion in general and Christianity in particular out of government and public life? Is George W. Bush at cross purposes with the men who drafted the First Amendment? What did they believe about religion and the new government they were creating? Even a cursory reading of the pronouncements of the Founding Fathers would seem to indicate otherwise. Madison himself said,
"We have staked the whole of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God."
I am a real Christian, that is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus.
The highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity.
In point of fact, in 1782, the United States Congress voted a resolution stating, "The Congress of the United States recommends and approves the Holy Bible for use in all schools."
The idea of God as a participant in public life appears to have been with us from the beginning. This is clearly reflected in the words of George Washington.
In tending this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States.
Abraham Lincoln openly acknowledged his convictions.
I have been driven many times upon my knees with the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for that day.
And barely 50 years ago, Dwight David Eisenhower stated,
"Without God, there could be no American form of government nor an American way of life. Recognition of the Supreme Being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism."
My relationship with God through Christ has given me meaning and direction. My faith has made a big difference in my personal life as in my public life as well. I make decisions every day. Some are easy and some aren't so easy. I have worries just like you do. And I pray. I pray for guidance. I pray for patience. I firmly believe in the power of intercessory prayer, and I know I could not do my job without it.
George W. Bush, it seems, was right in line with the Founding Fathers.
It is an historic fact that every one of our 43 presidents have referred to God in their inaugural addresses.
While most would agree that America was not established formally as a Christian nation, our forefathers unapologetically chose the Bible and its proven moral and ethical principles as that foundation. Perhaps the biggest problem for America today is not that our presidents have expressed a reliance on God, but that our courts and popular media have tried to hide that fact.
John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address, said the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. Harry S. Truman, in his inaugural, said we believe all men are created equal because we're created in the image of God. And then some say, well, they mentioned God, but they didn't mention Christianity. Well, I beg to differ. John Adams, the second president, in his inaugural address said,
I consider decent respect for Christianity among the best recommendations for public service.
From the inaugural address of William Henry Harrison, the ninth president, we read,
I deem the present occasion sufficiently important to express my profound reverence for the Christian religion in a thorough conviction that sound morals are essentially connected with all true and lasting happiness.
And from the inaugural address of our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln.
Intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on Him who has never yet forsaken this favored land are still competent to adjust in the best way all our present difficulty.
I have moments of doubt, moments of pride, and moments of hope. Yet my faith helps a lot because I have a sense of calm, knowing that the Bible's admonition, "Thy will be done," is life's guide. In this hectic world, there is something incredibly reassuring in the belief that there is a divine plan that exceeds all human plans.
All of these presidents in time of great calamity turned to God for guidance. Interestingly, and this seems to be the great difference, the historic record does not mention a single instance of a general uprising against any show of faith by any president except against President George W. Bush. Could it be that in what is perhaps America's greatest crisis since the Civil War, faith from the White House was needed more than ever? That President Bush's faith in God was firm and activated much of his life would seem to be beyond dispute. But what does that mean to the average citizen? How does it set him apart?
He said, "I want to be remembered as the man who walked in Walmart to buy fishing lures and used to be the governor. My dad was president. That's the only way I want people to think about me."
On September 11th, 2001, the nation and the world changed, perhaps forever. The events of 9/11 sent shockwaves around the globe. How would this new, young president stand up to this monstrous evil that now faced America? Did the nation see him rise up in righteous wrath or sink to his knees in prayer? Or did they see this young, neophyte president do both? One of President Reagan's advisors spoke out at that time.
I think that President Bush, with his vision and his leadership in a world troubled by terror, has the opportunity for greatness. His ability to stick with that, in spite of the fact that critics are attempting to force him off it, is what will determine whether or not the history books regard him as a great president. From everything I've seen so far, he is going to be that kind of president.
For a brief moment, when the mind-numbing horror of 9/11 was still settling in, America, once again, seemed to come together. America's churches were filled, and the nation looked to its leadership with hope and determination. The nation, indeed the world, was catapulted into war on that September morning. Since then, the question has been, does the expressed and apparently deeply held faith of the man who occupies the White House bring us closer together as a nation, or does it drive us apart? September 14th, 2001. The men working at Ground Zero were in desperate need of a ray of hope. As smoke and ash floated through the air and settled on the weary rescue workers, President Bush made his way through the crowd.
He hadn't planned on giving any speeches, but when he saw the desperation and sadness on the faces of the men around him, he felt compelled to encourage them if he could.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
It will probably be remembered as one of the greatest exchanges between a leader and his people in American history.
In the meantime, and through it all, President Bush continued to lead by example.
There were a group of people visiting a hospital ward where there were a lot of U.S. soldiers wounded in the Iraqi war. They came across a young man who'd had his arm amputated. There was an embarrassed silence. Nobody quite knew what to do, and then the president stepped forward. He knelt down by the bedside, took the stump in his hands, said a small prayer, then kissed the bandage. This was just an astonishing display of uninhibited kindness to a wounded soldier.
Not all Americans agree that we have always had the right man in the right position in a moment of crisis. But one thing is indisputable. Those who have led this nation in its darkest moments have always been willing to humble themselves before God and call the nation to prayer. The express faith of George Bush was simply an extension of that long and honored tradition. The real question is, will that tradition continue?
Without God, there is no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. Without God, we're mired in the material, that flat world that tells us only what the senses perceive. Without God, there is a coarsening of the society. And without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure. If we ever forget that we're one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under.